My name is Adaobi Tricia Nwaubani. My story is about the descendants of slaves in southeastern Nigeria and their activism for equality. Despite abolition of the slave trade around the world and in Nigeria in the early 20th century, till today, the descendants of slaves, freed slaves especially, are still being discriminated against. And in the past few years, there's been increasing agitation in many communities in southeastern Nigeria as these descendants of slaves fight for equality. Part of the discrimination includes not being allowed to take traditional leadership positions or titles. People who are freeborn are forbidden from marrying them. But finally, some groups, activists, and then the descendants of slaves themselves are saying it's time for this to end. And so my story is about the agitation, the activism, and the prospect for complete abolition in southeastern Nigeria. The New Yorker published an essay, a memoir I wrote about my great-grandfather. It was titled My Great-Grandfather, the Nigerian Slave Trader. And when I wrote that story, I mentioned, it was just one sentence or two where I mentioned discrimination, the current discrimination, the ongoing discrimination against people of slave descent. Unlike my first article, which was an essay, a memoir, this is a journalistic piece. So I'm away from the story this time. I'm letting the descendants of slaves talk for themselves. I'm letting the activists speak, and I'm letting the people who perpetuate the discrimination explain their reasons why. So the activists are using terms like abolition, and I'm thinking, I was listening to them, accompanying them to meetings, and I thought, goodness gracious, we're talking about abolition in Nigeria in 2019. And the horrors of the story just struck me the more as I traveled around the communities, listened to the activists, listened to the people, and I thought this is a story that has to be written. Now for this story, I didn't want people to say, oh, she's dealing with isolated cases. Oh, it's just a part of Nigeria, just a corner, just one community or two. There are 5 states in southeastern Nigeria, 5 Igbo states. And I made sure that I covered communities in every single one. I interviewed people in every single one of those states. I interviewed traditional rulers. So I did a lot of traveling, a lot of interviews to make sure that I would leave no doubt. People reading my story would read it and be left with no doubt at all that it was a pervasive issue. It wasn't just, it's not just about isolated cases. It is something that is happening all over Igbo land, amongst the Igbo people of southeastern Nigeria. It's something that is pervasive. And then something else I was particular about, because usually when we read these kinds of stories about discrimination, oppression, inhumanity, there's a class of Africans that, the suffering classes, I'll refer to them as that. We're used to reading stories about them suffering. Oh, they've been attacked. Oh, they've been robbed. They're diseased. Oh, they're suffering from disease, poverty. No. I made sure that the people I interviewed were people who were well-educated, a number of wealthy people that were still suffering from this discrimination. So it's not the typical, oh, this is a story about poor people in Africa that are, suffering from the things that poor people suffer from. No. I have the elites who are still being discriminated against. So it's not a question of, oh, it's because he's uneducated, or because he hasn't done well economically. No. These are acclaimed Nigerians, Igbo, people of Igbo descent, who are being discriminated against despite their accomplishments because of their ancestry.